All right, get ready to dive deep. Today, we're taking on the Crescendo User Manual. This isn't your typical boring manual. Think of it more like a guide to unlocking a sonic powerhouse. So if you've ever dreamed of making custom instruments and effects, well, this is your chance to get hands-on.
What's so cool about Crescendo is it's kind of hard to define. It's not just an instrument. It's not just an effect. It can be both. And even the manual points out how some DIWs, uh, those digital audio workstations, yeah, they kind of struggle with that.
So you're saying, depending on what DDI I'm using, Crescendo might act a little differently. I use Ableton Live, mainly.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So Ableton Live, along with a few others, LMMS, Reaper, Savvyhost, they've all been tested with Crescendo. But like anything, each DI has its quirks. Some are a bit more, shall we say, picky about whether a plugin is an instrument or an effect, but the manual, it's got you covered. There are some neat workarounds for those cases.
That makes sense. It's like Crescendo is so advanced that some DWs just haven't quite caught up yet.
Exactly. But the manual is your friend here. Now let's talk file management in Crescendo. This is where it starts to feel like a real sound lab. You'll be working with a bunch of different file types, but the best part is it's all drag and drop.
Drag and drop. That's way less scary than I thought it would be. So what kind of files are we talking about here?
Well, you've got your instrument definitions. Those are basically text files. And then you have like a whole buffet of audio samples. And for those who like to get adventurous with microtonal music, there are tuning files, plus MIDI sequencer data, and even, get this, sound font 2 files.
Okay, so we've got all these sonic ingredients ready to be tossed into Crescendo. But how does it all, come together? How's an instrument actually structured in Crescendo?
Crescendo's pretty clever about it. It uses a hierarchical system. It all starts with this instruction called include. Basically, it lets you pull in code from other files, which is really helpful for keeping your projects, organized. And it also lets you reuse those awesome sounds you create.
Oh, that makes sense. Like building a library of sounds to mix and match. So where do we actually start building?
It all begins with the common section. This is where you lay the groundwork for your instrument, setting global parameters, figuring out how to handle MIDI data, even making sure your interface looks good on high-resolution screens.
Hold on, high-resolution screens, like what's that got to do with making cool sounds?
It's all about DPI awareness. It just means that Crescendo's interface will look sharp and clear on those fancy high-res screens. No blurry knobs or anything like that.
Okay, I get it. So back to the common section, the manual calls it the control center. What kind of fun stuff can we do in there?
Well, think of it as the brain of your instrument. And one of the most powerful tools you have is the sample instruction. It lets you load and manipulate audio samples. You can even create your own synthetic waveforms right there in the plugin.
Wait, you're telling me I can build sounds from scratch inside Crescendo? That's amazing.
Oh, yeah, it's really powerful. It's like having a synth built right in it.
So what else is hiding in this common section? The manual mentions something called Samplee.
Ah, Samplee, one of my favorites. Basically, it lets you create interactive elements in the plugin's interface for swapping samples on the fly. Like, imagine building a drum kit where you can drag and drop different kick and snare samples to totally customize the sound.
Oh, that would be awesome. I could finally make my own custom drum kits.
Exactly.
Are there any other cool instructions in the common section?
Oh, yeah, tons. There's render for real-time audio manipulation, key switch for assigning special keys to trigger different features, and even sequencer for building patterns right inside Crescendo.
Wait, a built-in sequencer? That's insane.
Yeah, it's super powerful. You can create loops, arpeggios, melodies, anything you can imagine.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible with this common section.
Oh, we are. This is just the foundation of our instrument. Next, we'll jump into the exciting world of MIDI processing. That's where we take those raw MIDI messages and shape them into something truly expressive.
Okay, I'm ready for more. Let's do it.
MIDI processing. It's like being a musical puppeteer. You get to take those raw MIDI messages and really shape them, add those little touches that make a sound come alive.
Okay, you've got my attention. How does Crescendo handle MIDI processing? Is it pretty straightforward, or is this where things get really technical?
Crescendo actually breaks it down into 4 stages. First up, you have the input stage. Here you can be like a bouncer at a club, only letting in the MIDI messages you actually want.
Haha, I like that analogy. So if I'm using a keyboard with a bunch of knobs and sliders, I can choose which ones actually control my crescendo instrument.
Yeah, exactly. It's great for cleaning up messy MIDI data or just like focusing on the controls that really matter for your sound.
Hmm.
And then comes the post-processing stage. This is where things start to get fun. You can do things like remap notes, adjust the timing, transpose pitches, and even fine-tune the velocity response.
Yeah.
So you can play really expressively.
Wait, velocity response, does that mean I can make it so that hitting a key harder doesn't just make the sound louder, but also changes its, like, tone?
You got it. It's all about making your instruments feel really dynamic and responsive to your playing. Crescendo gives you incredible control over how those MIDI messages translate into sound. And then we get into the world of temperaments and microtuning. This is where things can get a little mind-bending.
Microtuning. I've always been curious about that, but it's always seemed so complex. Is Crescendo making this stuff accessible for, like, someone like me who's just starting out?
Absolutely. Crescendo uses these instructions called temperament and temperament CA. They let you define custom tuning systems, beyond that standard 12-tone equal temperament that we're all used to. Imagine creating scales and harmonies that have never been heard before.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. So I can make an instrument that sounds like totally alien or even recreate historical tuning systems. The possibilities are endless.
Exactly. And with Crescendo, you can even use MIDI controllers to change the temperament on the fly, which adds another layer of expression to your playing. And remember, all this MIDI magic is happening in the Commons section, which we talked about earlier.
So we've got the common section for global settings and MIDI processing. What's next in our Crescendo journey?
Well, before we jump into sound generation, there's this optional section called the POST section. Think of it as the final stage of audio processing, like adding those finishing touches to a masterpiece.
Okay, so this is where we add effects to the whole instrument, like reverb or delay.
It can be, but it's so much more than that. The POST section is incredibly flexible. You can use these variables out, T, out 10, in, and in to manipulate audio signals and create like complex routing scenarios.
Routing scenarios, that sounds a bit like a mixing board. So I could create multiple outputs from my instrument and process them independently.
You got it. It's like having a mini mixing console built right into your instrument. You can split the signal, apply different effects, and then bring it all back together in creative ways.
Wow, that opens up a whole new level of sound design.
Absolutely. And the POST section is super useful for both instruments and effects. You can use it for anything from subtle spatialization to extreme distortion.
Okay, so we've got the common section, the optional POST section, but where do we actually create the sound itself, the core material of our instrument?
That's where layers come in. Each layer is like its own little sound generating unit inside your instrument. It has its own trigger conditions, its own sound generation instructions, its own output routing.
So an instrument can have multiple layers, each responding to different inputs or playing different sounds.
Exactly. Imagine a drum kit where each drum is a separate layer or a synth with multiple oscillators layered on top of each other. The possibilities are limitless.
That's so cool. So how do we control when these layers are actually triggered? Is it all just MIDI notes?
MIDI notes are the most common way, yeah. But Crescendo gives you a lot more flexibility. You can use these different trigger conditions, like on Atinum for note-on events, on NMCCT, and off FMCCT for changes of MIDI CC values, and even on Keist for using those key switches we talked about earlier.
Key switches as triggers. So I could have one layer for like a long pad sound, and then use a key switch to activate a different layer for a percussive attack, all within the same instrument.
Exactly. That's the kind of creative control Crescendo gives you. And there's even more. You can group layers together using the GRU instruction so they act exclusively.
Exclusively. What does that mean?
It means that when one layer in a group is triggered, the others are automatically silenced. Like, think of a group of cymbal sounds. You usually only want one cymbal ringing at a time.
That makes sense. So groups help create more realistic instruments.
Exactly. And then there's the XAD instruction, which lets you smoothly blend between layers based on MIDI CC values. Imagine a synth pad that gradually morphs from a warm analog sound to a bright digital texture just by turning a knob.
Wow, that sounds incredible. XFAD seems like a really powerful tool for creating those smooth transitions.
It is. And remember, all this layer control, the triggering, the grouping, the crossfading, it all adds up to create instruments that are incredibly expressive and dynamic. But now the question is, how do we actually generate the sound for each layer.
That's the big question. We've talked about samples and synthetic waveforms, but how do they actually become sound within Crescendo? Is it all about oscillators? Okay, so modulation, it's what takes a sound from like static to dynamic, right? It's what makes it come alive.
Exactly. Modulation is like breathing life into your sounds,
Yeah.
making them move, groove, react to your playing.
Yeah.
And Crescendo gives you a ton of tools to play with in this area.
So where do we start? What are the core elements of modulation in Crescendo?
Well, you've got your LFOs, those is low-frequency oscillators. They
Mhm.
create those rhythmic pulses, wobbles, sweeps. Crescendo goes beyond that.
Yeah.
You also have envelope generators, MIDI-CC control, and even something called VST variables.
VST variables, what are those?
Think of them like the control knobs on your virtual instrument. They can represent anything: filter cutoff, modulation depth, the speed of an LFO. And you can link these VST variables to your MIDI controllers.
Oh, I see. So that's how I can use my MIDI keyboard or control surface to tweak things in real time.
Exactly. It's like having hands-on control over every aspect of the sound. And with Crescendo's mapping system, you can connect those controllers to almost any parameter you want.
Okay, now we're talking. I can already see myself getting lost in all those knobs and faders.
And it gets even deeper. Crescendo also supports side chaining.
Side chaining, that rings a bell, but I'm not sure I fully get it.
It's a technique where the audio from one source, like a kick drum, controls a parameter in another source, like a synth pad. So every time the kick drum hits, it could, say, duck the volume of the synth, creating that pumping effect.
Ah, okay, so that's what side chaining is.
Exactly. And with Crescendo, you can use it to control any parameter, not just volume. It's super powerful for creating rhythmic and dynamic textures.
So we've got LFOs, envelopes, MIDI CCs, VST variables, side chaining. It sounds like we've got a lot of tools for creating some really interesting sounds.
We do. And speaking of interesting sounds, let's talk about lookup tables, or LUTs.
LUTs, we've mentioned them before, but I'm still a little fuzzy on what they are.
Imagine a graph that defines a relationship between an input and an output. It lets you create these nonlinear transformations, going beyond the simple straight lines of traditional modulation.
Okay, so instead of just having a smooth, gradual change in a parameter, I could use a LUT to create like curves, steps, or even random patterns.
Exactly. LUTs are really powerful for shaping how your sounds respond to modulation. You can use them to create anything from subtle warmth to extreme distortion.
Wow, that's pretty wild.
They really are a sound designer's dream.
Okay, so we've explored this fascinating world of modulation in Crescendo, but there's one key ingredient we haven't talked about yet: filters and effects.
Yes. Crescendo wouldn't be complete without a good set of filters and effects.
So what kind of filters can we play with?
It has all the classics: low pass, high pass, band pass. But it also has some more specialized ones like band reject filters and even formant filters.
Formant filters, those are the ones that can make sounds talk, right?
That's right. You can create robotic voices, realistic vocal simulations, all sorts of cool stuff. And of course, you've got your delays and reverbs for adding space and depth, plus a bunch of modulation effects like chorus, flanger, phaser.
Ah, the classics. What else is there?
Well, if you like things a bit distorted, there are a bunch of distortion algorithms. And for those who want to create really immersive soundscapes, there are spatialization effects.
Wow, it's like having an entire studio inside this plugin.
It really is. And remember, you can modulate all these filters and effects using the techniques we discussed earlier.
It's incredible how much depth there is to this plugin. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, and it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
That's the beauty of Crescendo. There's always more to explore.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Crescendo user manual, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I'd say the most important thing is to just experiment. Don't be afraid to dig into the manual, play with the parameters, and see what you can create. The possibilities are truly endless.
Couldn't agree more. The Crescendo user manual is more than just a manual. It's a gateway to a world of sonic possibilities. So, to all our listeners out there, go explore, experiment, and discover the magic of Crescendo. Until next time.